Greetings, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining me tonight as I talk about the pre-hospital medical response to active shooter incidents, the Rescue Task Force concept. My name is Steve Wyman. I am with the trauma program at St. Joseph's University Medical Center in Paterson, New Jersey. We are an urban level 2 trauma center. And I also serve in a more suburban part of the state, Somerset County, in the Office of Emergency Management, where I am the EMS Bureau Chief. And additionally, I also serve as the Rescue Task Force Program Leader for the county. So I have the luxury of speaking to you tonight, both from my vantage point as an emergency nurse, as well as a pre-hospital rescue task force clinician. So again, welcome tonight. I'm glad you could join me. I have nothing to disclose. And I want to dedicate this talk tonight to the memory of Jersey City, New Jersey Detective Joseph Seals. Detective Seals paid the ultimate price, killed in the line of duty on December 12th, 2019, in an active shooter incident in Jersey City, New Jersey. So what I'm really trying to do with this talk today is to really go over the current literature regarding active shooters and really kind of hone on the event that these events are occurring in increasing quantities year after year. So because these events are occurring, it is imperative that the emergency nurse understands the pre-hospital approach to providing medical care to the victims of active shooter incidents. The session also contributes to your nursing practice by enhancing your knowledge and awareness of what the pre-hospital medical response approach is. And this, I hope, leads to enhanced readiness, improved care transition, and ultimately better outcomes should you unfortunately ever be involved in any kind of an active shooter event and have to receive casualties from such event. Basically, it's not a matter of if an active shooter event is going to occur, it's a matter of when and where. And again, you can go on the TV almost any night, go online almost at any time, and headlines will pop up about another active shooter or mass shooting incident somewhere within the United States. These occur in many cases on not only a weekly basis, but sometimes a daily basis. Right now, we're sitting on the heels of an event that happened in Sacramento just about 3 nights ago from the time that I'm recording this talk today. In this particular incident, there were 6 people that were killed and 12 that were wounded. So I don't know what type of facility you work in, be it a basic emergency department, whether it's a rural ED, a suburban ED, an urban ED, a trauma center, or not a trauma center. There's no doubt that getting possibly 12 and possibly maybe even 18, if these individuals weren't declared dead on scene, arriving in your emergency department, or even 4 or 5 of them, if there's divided out among several departments, that it wouldn't constitute a pretty big deal for your department. So the reality is that we all need to be prepared to receive these patients and understand the care that they receive prior to them coming to the hospital so that we can better care for them once they arrive within the cement and mortar that make up our hospitals. So let's first talk about what an active shooter is by definition. So an active shooter is an incident in which one or more people use deadly force on other people and continue to do so while having unrestricted access to victims. The FBI defines it as an individual actively engaged in killing or attempting to kill people in a populated area. So basically, it's person with gun shooting at lots of people, and there's lots of people around. In a populated area means more than 2 people in an area. So the reality is that an active shooter, or sometimes it's called a mass shooting response, really can be a big deal, and often is a big deal. However, when we look at the statistics even more, about 65% of active shooter incidents are over in about 5 minutes or less. They are very rapid incidents. 90% are over in less than 12, but the vast majority are over in 5 minutes or less. The average incident results in only 4 people shot, with 2 people being killed. For some trauma centers, some urban trauma centers, the one that I work at in Paterson, if we were to get 4 gunshot wound victims in just one fell swoop, and it happens all too often, It's just another night in the emergency department. There are others of you that are out there that are working in smaller departments, rural departments, or lower staff departments that for gunshot wound victims coming to your door, be it by EMS or by the front door at any given time, that may almost cripple your resources and almost institute a mass casualty response from the institution. So the reality is it's all in the eyes of the beholder and in how you are equipped and set up to be able to handle these patients when they come in. When we look over the past 5 years, the numbers really are all over the board. They range from 0 people injured, a guy gets up in a populated area and starts to shoot, but fortunately doesn't hit anybody, and therefore there are no injured. And the mortality has ranged upwards of 58 killed and 900 injured. And for that, that was the Country Music Festival in Las Vegas I think it was about 6 years ago now, where you had a massive, massive number of people shot. I believe like Nyan told of about 411 that were shot. You had almost double that number that were injured as a result of trying to get out of a confined space very, very quickly. But 58 people were killed, making it the largest mass shooting incident in the history of the United States. Not something to be proud of. Active shooter incidents plague our society, as this graphic shows. They are increasing year after year, okay? And they're occurring in a diverse number of places. So you can't just say, they're only happening in New York City. Oh, they're only happening in Los Angeles or Dallas or Orlando. They're not. They're occurring everywhere. They're occurring in rural Missouri, in Idaho, Nevada, Michigan, okay? Indiana. I mean, they literally can occur any place at any time. And they're not going to occur in the places you think so. Sometimes they occur in very small rural houses of worship. Sometimes they do occur in a shopping mall with a heavy population. So again, the reality is that they are going to happen, but they're going to happen where they're going to happen. And contrary to popular belief, these are not all school shootings. When you look at school shootings as a source of active shooter incidents, it's actually number 3 on the hit parade. Okay, number 1 is just businesses that are open to pedestrian traffic. That's grocery stores, malls, sporting venues, right? Open spaces in general, fields, such as what happened with the Las Vegas active shooter. Businesses that are closed to pedestrian traffic. That could be the post office, where we all learned the term "go postal" many, many years ago for individuals that would come back into work with grievances and shoot up their boss. So the reality is that these incidents happen over a myriad of locations: government properties, houses of worship, houses, residences, military installations, etc. Now, the methodology and how first responders, particularly police and then fire and EMS, responded to active shooter incidents have really evolved. And as such, the pre-hospital treatment of survivors has evolved. We no longer call somebody who has survived an active shooter incident a victim, we call them a survivor. As a result of being able to better take care of the survivors, we as emergency nurses need to be aware of what these changes are. And again, from a downstream effect, be able to ensure that there's a good continuity of care that occurs after the point of handoff from our pre-hospital colleagues. The pre-hospital setting, as we all need to remember, is an extension of the continuum of care for our patients as we're taking care of them in the hospital. Let's never forget that. The key takeaway messages of this particular talk are: we need to, in the realm of active shooter, particularly in the pre-hospital setting, is we need to first stop the shooting. We need to then stop the bleeding or the hemorrhaging that may occur as a result of these active shooter incidents. And then ultimately, by doing so, we will stop the dying. And we'll talk about this sequentially. Let's talk first about stopping the shooting. A shift in response philosophy happened as a result of the 1999 shooting at the high school in Columbine, Colorado. For decades, public safety, particularly the law enforcement community, struggled with how to best respond and intervene for active shooter type incidents. In Columbine in 1999, at the time of this shooting, the law enforcement response was pretty much first arriving law enforcement would come on scene, create a perimeter, an inner perimeter, which meant nobody got out of the school because they didn't want the bad guy or guys or gals leaving. They would create an outer perimeter, which is an area that nobody came into the scene on. That was a safe zone for EMS, police, the media, families that were perhaps coming, the public in general. And then they waited for tactical law enforcement, or as we call them, SWAT, to arrive. They didn't enter the building, they didn't intervene, they just sat and waited. And then when SWAT got there, SWAT went in and they took care of the bad guys, and then started to pull out the people that were injured. Now that's problematic because even in the most urbanized parts of the country where they have dedicated SWAT officers or tactical law enforcement officers, that response can still be a half an hour in the making. In most areas of the country where tactical law enforcement are not dedicated solely to being tactical law enforcement, they serve other roles and responsibilities in law enforcement and then get called to respond to these tactical or active shooter incidents. It could take upwards of 45 minutes to 90 minutes for them to respond, suit up, gear up, and go into the scene to render and neutralize the bad guy or the bad lady. And as a result of that, it doesn't work out. And yeah, we saw that with Columbine. We saw that an attack lasted 45 minutes in Columbine. It was over 3 hours until all of the wounded were evacuated from the high school. There was no medical care that was provided within the school whatsoever. And as a result, 24 students and faculty were injured, 12 died. And in a study done probably about 15 years later, they looked back at the 12 fatalities and looked at autopsy reports and felt that possibly up to 6 of the mortalities could have actually survived had medical care been afforded in a timely fashion. So after Columbine, law enforcement really took a hard look at the way it responded, and they determined we have got to stop the shooting as quickly as possible. And as a result of that, it wasn't an overnight incarnation, but within a very short period of time, law enforcement went with the paradigm shift of we now will get our first arriving officers to make entry into the scene, find the bad guy or late gal, and neutralize them. And that happened, 1999 going into 2000. Now, despite the fact that there was this paradigm shift for law enforcement, other first responders, particularly the medical first responders, EMS or fire-based EMS, did not follow suit. Another 10 years and countless number of other active shooter incidents went by until one EMS community began to implement change. That was with the Virginia Tech shooting back in 2007. It was an absolute wake-up call for the Arlington, Virginia Fire Department. In this particular instance, there were 32 students and faculty and some bystanders that were killed. The injured were tended to pretty quickly by law enforcement on scene, tactical medics who were embedded with law enforcement, and local EMS. Again, they have a very good pre-hospital care system in Arlington, as well as some local municipalities surrounding there. They did get EMS on scene very quickly, and they did treat very quickly, but it really still was not quick enough. So this became a wake-up call for the medical director of the Arlington County Fire EMS Department. And basically, E. Reed Smith is the physician, said, you know what, this just doesn't work. He had been studying, he had been looking at and working with translating what had been happening at this point in time for about 7 years on battlefield casualties and the improvement that they had been seeing in battlefield injuries as a result of some interventions that were done there, and said, can we matriculate them and can we bring them over to the civilian sector, particularly in an active shooter incident, which isn't a foregone change from an active battle situation in Afghanistan or Iraq. Well, it was Iraq at this time. And could we do something? And he translated civilian translation of what was being done in the battlefield, and using some tactics that they were using, he coined the term the Rescue Task Force and started to put together a Rescue Task Force within his own department. Now, what is a rescue task force? Well, a rescue task force is very simply put. We all know what rescue is, right? It's to go in and it is to pull somebody out of harm's way. So rescue is pretty, from a nomenclature standpoint, pretty well understood. But what's the role of a task force? So in the vernacular of the incident command system, which I know we have all been required to sit through some droning lectures on ICS 100 and the way you stand up and you structure the response to a large scale incident. A task force is a group of mixed occupations or mixed subjects. A strike team would be similar subjects. So if we were to get together 5 emergency nurses, and the 5 emergency nurses were to go in as a group into a situation, that would be a strike team. But when you start mixing them up with multiple disciplines, in this case, you have law enforcement, you add EMS, and then maybe you add fire to that. You now have mixed use, therefore it's by incident command terms, or ICS terms, a task force. And that's really what a rescue task force is. It's an admix of law enforcement and medical providers who are geared up and trained to enter into a more austere environment than they normally would enter into in order to very quickly assess, intervene, and then ultimately extricate victims of active shooter incidents more quickly than they otherwise would be extricated and treated in the past. The basic tenets of RTF is, again, law enforcement gets on scene, they go in, and they either contain or neutralize the threat. At that point in time, residual law enforcement that are not needed to deal with the bad guy anymore will start initial medical care of survivors. And then specially trained teams that come in, that are specially trained medical teams, come in with under the protective watch of the police department. Because remember, even though the bad guy is down, it doesn't mean the scene is safe. It doesn't mean that every potential bad hazard has been mitigated. That's going to take hours, and we don't have time to do that. But if we go in under the watchful eye, maybe send medical providers in under the watchful eye of law enforcement who are trained to look for these bad things and then interdict for these bad things, then we can bring these providers in, and they can now treat those that are the survivors that are injured, and then ultimately extricate them. And then when they extricate them, they take them directly out, put them in ambulances, give a very quick report to the EMT or the medic that may be in the ambulance, and that ambulance speeds off to definitive care. A much more intuitive system for dealing with victims of mass carnage. Now, while RTF, Rescue Task Force, is a great concept, at this point in time, and I'm talking 2008, 2009, there were very few EMS and fire agencies that initially adapted it for whatever reason. And there was a cacophony of different reasons that they didn't. None of them that are really germane for the purposes of the talk tonight. But I will give you a reference at the end that if you are so interested in wanting to know what that might have been, it'll provide you with that information. So then came the straw that broke the camel's back from a medical standpoint. We had the Sandy Hook, Newtown, Connecticut active shooter massacre, is what it was, that occurred in December of 2012. At the time of Sandy Hook, we were now 13 years post-Columbine. And again, despite the fact that the Rescue Task Force concept had been around for about 4 years at this point in time, we still really had not seen it taking up the grasp that it needs to. At the time of Sandy Hook, we ended up with 20 children and 6 adults that perished. They were massacred in this particular incident. It became problematic, and there really was kind of a cry to arms here. The biggest crier, or the loudest voice in the room, was a physician, a surgeon, a trauma surgeon by the name of Lenworth Jacobs. And Dr. Jacobs was the trauma chief at Hartford Hospital in Hartford, Connecticut, the state's primary level 1 trauma center. He was also the chairman of the Connecticut Trauma Committee. And he said something has to change. Our medical response has got to change. We have to start responding better to these horrific events. So Dr. Jacobs, who was very active in the American College of Surgeons, actually was the torchbearer for what we now know as stopping the bleeding. So with Sandy Hook lighting the fuse, Dr. Jacobs got with the American College of Surgeons Committee on Trauma, and they convened the Joint Committee to create a national policy to enhance survivability from intentional mass casualty and active shooter events. That doesn't really roll off your tongue. So when the group got together initially, they met in Hartford, Connecticut, and at least the initial meeting at the very top picture, that was the initial meeting of the group. It was, you can see about 7 people, but 7 people who represented a pretty good cross section of the community. And represented here were obviously hospital-based practitioners in trauma and emergency care, but also represented here was law enforcement, pre-hospital medical care, and the National Defense Department, the Department of Defense. Because remember, a lot of what we have learned with regards to how to treat people after an active shooter incident, as Dr. Reed pointed out in Arlington about 4 years before, really was translation from the military. So having the Department of Defense at the table was very important. So this group met, they met in Hartford, Connecticut, and because this joint committee to create the blah, blah, blah was way too long to come out of the mouth, they actually just called themselves the group who came up with the Hartford Consensus. And the Hartford Consensus is really not just one meeting, but it is a number of meetings that happened. And as you saw on the slide, let me see, I don't think I can go back, but there were a number of organizations that were involved. And by the time you got down to this picture at the bottom with the most number of people, you had active involvement from a lot of organizations. And in particular, you had the Emergency Nurses Association, the Society for Trauma Nurses, as well as the American College of Emergency Physicians involved. There were a lot of also pre-hospital agencies that were involved. The National Association for Emergency Medical Technicians, etc., were involved. And they sat through not what was the first meeting, but 3 additional meetings that then developed the ultimate output for the Hartford Consensus. And the third meeting of the Hartford Consensus was really the monkey in the room that really got things going, and that was implementation of bleeding control. So anyone who hasn't seen the Hartford Consensus, or if you have an interest in reading about the Hartford Consensus, it's easy to get a hold of the PDF for this by just simply Googling Hartford Consensus, and you'll pull up the American College of Surgeons Committee on Trauma bulletin that outlines in great detail the workings of both the Hartford Consensus and what their output was. So in summary, what the Hartford Consensus basically said is we need to get survivors treated, extricated, and delivered to definitive care as quickly as possible after they're injured. Again, it's not something that this is not something that's new to us as both pre-hospital clinicians and emergency nurses. We know that trauma, and particularly hemorrhage, is the #1 killer in trauma, and the only way you stop hemorrhage in trauma is to get them to definitive care. So at the end of the day, we knew everything that they were talking about to be true, just it wasn't organized in a fashion that we really needed it to be. And certainly the Hartford Consensus did this. So the Hartford Consensus took the THREAT acronym, THREAT, and they said, boom, we're going to have somebody who initially goes in and stops the bad guy. That was already being done by law enforcement, the threat suppression, okay? Once that threat suppression is done, then we need to start controlling hemorrhage, okay? Anybody who's bleeding externally or anyone who's identified as bleeding internally needs to be identified and then triaged appropriately. That can be done by both law enforcement and then, again, individuals who may be specially trained to go into these less than safe environments. We need to then rapidly extricate survivors. We need to get them into ambulances, and we need to get them to go, which means we don't pull out red tarps and yellow tarps and green tarps anymore and start retriaging and intervening. It means we put them in a vehicle with wheels and we get them off the X, which means we get them off the scene and we get them to definitive care. In order to make all of this happen, there were a couple of things, a couple of caveats, a couple of steps that were built into this process. First one was the recognition that at the scene of any kind of a bad incident, there are bystanders. Even in an active shooter incident, there are bystanders, those that are not injured, that are willing to render aid. So if we can take those individuals, and we can train them to recognize bleeding and intervene appropriately and call them, give them a title, immediate responders, and we can train them and really give them, empower them to step up, and they will step up. then that will be the way of at least trying to arrest hemorrhage almost immediately. The next thing we had to do is train first responders and stop the bleed. So we had to train law enforcement, we needed to train EMS, and we needed to train fire in how to recognize and control external bleeding. Then we needed to develop these rescue task force teams that would go in with law enforcement and do hemorrhage control, rapid extrication, and then triage out to waiting ambulances. And then last but not least, we needed to, my picture I think is probably obscuring this a little bit, but we needed to facilitate transport to the appropriate first receivers. And that's us. That's the emergency nurses, that is the emergency physicians, that are the trauma surgeons and the technicians that are waiting in the hospital who will then affect the definitive care of these patients. And if we can put this chain into place, then it was believed that this could make a difference in survivability for victims of active shooter incidents. The end result at the end of the day was a ton of different training and educational courses that we use from a pre-hospital standpoint that are now integrated into the fabric of pre-hospital active shooter care. The one that we're going to really focus in for the purposes of today is the Stop the Bleed program. Because if you haven't heard of Stop the Bleed, then you've been living under a rock for the last 7 years. So nurses, fortunately and not surprisingly, were the earliest adopters of the output from the Hartford Consensus, particularly the Stop the Bleed movement. Of 100,000 instructors, and this dates back a little bit ago, but I don't think the numbers have changed statistically much, 34% of the instructors were nurses, 21% were other pre-hospital clinicians, which included EMTs and medics, and 6% were physicians. So really, when you tally that up, over 50% of your instructors are medical providers. Now, Stop the Bleed wasn't something that you just had to be a nurse, a doctor, a medic to teach. There's a list probably now of about 40 different professions that can become Stop the Bleed instructors and promulgate the Stop the Bleed philosophy. But certainly nurses, high five, were the earliest adapters and were percentage-wise the largest number of anyone who was out there actively engaged with teaching Stop the Bleed in the community. And again, Stop the Bleed really, from a layperson standpoint, was really empowering a bystander to step up and help out. Not be afraid to help, and realize that if you help, you're going to save lives, and you're not going to hurt somebody by stepping up and moving them or doing an intervention on them, so long as you're doing it something that's within the realm of how you've been trained. And Stop the Bleed was very simple. It was teaching people to recognize what uncontrolled external bleeding is and how to intervene. So how to either use direct pressure, application of a tourniquet, or pack a wound in order to slow or stop catastrophic external hemorrhage in survivors. Very simple. 3 very basic skill sets that people can learn and go out and maybe save some lives on. And they were trained. Not only did we train lay people, but we also wanted to make sure that pre-hospital clinicians were also trained. Law enforcement were trained. We wanted to make sure that even those of us that are hospital-based clinicians, we knew what we were doing, because none of us were taught in nursing school or medical school how to apply a cat tourniquet, how to pack a wound. And we've always been told kind of some wrong information about what direct pressure is and where it is. So this course actually leveled the playing field and really reset it to where everybody was really kind of learning the same thing. And guess what? This was correct information. And that's what we have done. So over a period of time, teachers have Stop the Bleed, and these are photographs from probably over, I think today, probably 200 Stop the Bleed classes that I've personally been involved with since Stop the Bleed came out in 2016, that we're out there teaching. And we're out there teaching high school students. We're out there teaching at the bottom Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. And we're out there teaching teachers in the high schools and the elementary schools. We're teaching clergy, nuns, how to pack a wound. We are out there on the streets teaching people in urban environments the basics of how to recognize and intervene if somebody is shot in their neighborhood. Okay, we taught fire, police, EMS, and we even taught ourselves. We went out and we taught trauma surgeons how to properly apply a CAT tourniquet. Because guess what? They didn't know how. Nurses, we didn't know how. And again, along the spectrum. So we really have a universality to how we're doing things, and it's working out very nicely. So now we are stopping the bleeding in the pre-hospital section leading up to the hospital. Now it's up to us to make sure that the dying stops. And ultimately, that's going to rest with the specialized rescue task force teams, and then ultimately us as the receivers in the hospital. So once we had the information out there, and once the curriculums were developed for Rescue Task Force, which had already been started to be done by Dr. Reed in Arlington back in 2009, we now were able to translate this and get it out into the general public. The picture you see here now is not uncommon. 5 years ago, this was an uncommon picture to see, but this is not anymore. And that is EMS professionals, EMS clinicians, medically trained firefighters that are donning protective gear and that are helping at the scene of incidents that aren't always the most secure. The National Association for Emergency Medical Technicians adapted the curriculum that had been created for battlefield soldiers and translated it into point of injury care through collaboration with the Department of Defense and a committee of physicians, nurses, medics, and EMTs, as well as firefighters and soldiers, called the Committee on Tactical Emergency Casualty Care. And we created a program that became, if you will, or we created a set of guidelines that became the network in which we were able to train pre-hospital medical providers as well as hospital-based clinicians. I've had the pleasure of serving on the committee for tactical emergency casualty care for about 4 years now. And there's just been a lot of tremendous work that has come out and tremendous number of lives that I believe have been saved as a result of this. So the specialized training for pre-hospital providers is pretty intense. We teach them the basics of what it means to go into an environment that is not necessarily safe, how to stay safe, be safe, and then render aid to survivors, get them off the X, as I said earlier, get them out of the scene, and then ultimately get them into an ambulance where they're going to be taken to the hospital. And this was a major paradigm shift, okay? Very major. And what was the most major about it wasn't necessarily what we were doing from a medical standpoint, although some of it was, but a lot of it was just the environment we were working in. It was the fact that we were not working in an environment that was 100% safe. And that's not, unusual in pre-hospital care. You never know if you're going to go into a scene that has been declared safe and it's going to go sideways on you very quickly and become unsafe. But generally speaking, that's not the rule. But we're not asking people to go into scenes that knowingly possibly are not safe. And that's a big paradigm shift for them. So what we've done is we went from, as you remember, I talked about earlier, this inner perimeter, outer perimeter that we did during Columbine, and we created the 3 zones of care: the hot zone, the warm zone, and the cold zone. The hot zone is a danger area. It's a direct threat environment. It means there's an active shooter. There's an active assailant who's in there. He's hurting people. He's trying to kill people. He's shooting people and ultimately needs to be stopped. Law enforcement only are going into this environment and they're stopping that shooting. Once that has been done, then they, if they have enough numbers and the scene is solid enough, they can start doing some initial medical treatment. But at this point in time, this is where we want to bring in RTF operations. Our rescue task force at this time comes in. It's considered an indirect threat because there's not a direct threat of somebody shooting at you, but you don't know if there's a second or secondary or tertiary threat that may be there. It could be incendiary devices. It could be another person who's hiding somewhere who jumps out and starts shooting. That hasn't been rendered safe yet. But again, the RTF operations, we're going in under the jurisdiction of the cops. We make sure we have a police escort with us, and we're going in to stop whatever bleeding we see, hemorrhaging, doing a rapid triage, and then evacuating the casualties out to what's called a casualty collection point. That casualty collection point then becomes what's called an AEP, or an ambulance exchange point. That's where we will turn over our care, or we will turn over our our survivors to awaiting ambulances. So ambulances are staging out there, fire is staging out there, and ultimately we are putting them in the ambulance and they are being taken to definitive care, obviously in a cold zone, a hospital, where they will stop the dying. Ideally, the RTF teams are rapidly turning over survivors to EMS for immediate transport. It doesn't always happen that way. It certainly depends on what resources you have in the pre-hospital environment and whatnot. But we do know from enough instances where RTF has been implemented that that it works. It certainly does work, and we're happy to see that. Now, when we look at what the medical needs of survivors are, it doesn't differ from an active shooter from somebody who's shot on the street or a car accident. But we're operating in that warm zone, and we're operating as an RTF with the ballistic headgear and vests, and we're operating with limited resources. We can't take an entire ambulance of equipment into these situations. We can't take cardiac monitors and oxygen and portable ventilators. We're not taking stretchers in with us. We just don't have the mobility and the time and the bandwidth to handle that. But what we're doing is we're going in with basic bleeding control supplies that allow us to take care of those survivors that are the most seriously injured and get them extricated. We also have changed our algorithm. We've moved away from the CABC component, and we use what's called the March algorithm. And that basically means is that our attention is being paid to stopping massive external hemorrhage, maintaining an airway, and that's really in many cases just through simple nasopharyngeal airway insertion and recovery position placement for somebody who's got altered level of consciousness, covering chest wounds with chest seals, and then monitoring for tension pneumothorax. What we have found is that the majority of people who can die unattended after an active shooter event are dying from tension pneumothorax. So we want to make sure that we cover any wounds, and we'll talk about what that means in a minute, on the abdomen and on the torso with vented chest seals, and then we extricate them once again as quickly as possible, and we monitor for signs and symptoms of tension pneumothorax. From a circulation standpoint, we're not popping IVs in at this point in time, and in most cases, the individuals that are going in are not credentialed to do so. So we're really just watching their circulatory status, we're monitoring them, and we're triaging them based on what our assessment findings are, and then we are particularly preventing hypothermia from happening, but we're also making sure that if they've got a head injury that we're tending to them as appropriately as possible when necessary. So really the caveats of Rescue Task Force in the pre-hospital environment is rapid entry into that active shooter scene. All right, they're going in when the primary threat is eliminated, but not all threats are eliminated. That makes it a very different environment to be working in as a pre-hospital clinician than we normally do. We're rapidly identifying survivors needing immediate care, and we're extricating them. We're putting in stopgap measures to slow or stop external bleeding and mitigate the development of tension pneumothorax. We're rapidly extricating them from the scene. We're handing them off to EMS, and then they are rapidly transporting, hopefully, to definitive care. And that is what RTF does in a nutshell. But that's not the end of the continuum, right? Because once we have now put these patients in an ambulance, they're coming to you. So what does your readiness need to be as first receivers of casualties? How many of us have been there or seen these great pictures of, we've got a call coming from the comm center that we've got multiple casualties coming in. So we go out there and we line all of our stretchers up in front of the emergency department. What? Or we're out there with our little pop-up tents, and we've got caution tape, and we've got everyone in vests and clipboards, and we're all standing around having a cup of coffee while we're waiting for these victims to show up. Is that very realistic? Not with an active shooter. Absolutely not. This is more likely what we're going to see coming up the ER drive or coming in the front door. We're going to see citizens, bystanders, immediate responders who have actually taken it on themselves to get those individuals to you. And they're not going to be coming by ambulance. They're going to be coming by police car, pickup truck, VWs. Okay? They're going to be coming in Audis. They're going to be coming in Hondas. They're going to be coming in Hyundais. And they may even be coming via police car. This is from the Las Vegas shooting. In the backseat of the police car is a victim who was shot in the head. Um, Law enforcement said, we need to get her to a trauma center. Can't be allowed to lay there. They picked her up. They threw her in the back of the car. Here they are arriving at the trauma center. And this happens time and time again. In fact, if you if you work in, I don't know if anybody out there works in any of the Philly hospitals, but in Philadelphia, the cops have been transporting gunshot wound victims for over a decade to the hospital with better results than if they come by ambulance. So here they are taking the victim out. Body cam is showing they're basically picking her up, alley-ooping her, bringing her in, and then ultimately getting her into the emergency department. Not waiting for that ambulance to come, right? With the Las Vegas shooting, there were over 900 victims that arrived at hospitals in the Las Vegas area. How many of them do you think arrived by ambulance? Less than 20%. 80% arrived by means other than the traditional ambulance, which means that these are people who are showing up typically unannounced. They've also been given the term, if you haven't heard it before, of no notice MCI. So this could be your only notice of the fact that you are getting casualties is when they start showing up on your door. And if they show up on your door en masse, then you are just like the pre-hospital clinicians out there. You are having to go back to basics and do the first receiver approach to stop the bleed. So what do you need to know how to do? Well, that. Everything that our pre-hospital colleagues needed to do, we need to do. We need to be able to, once again, identify and stop any kind of external bleeding that's going on. We need to make sure we are putting tourniquets on when appropriately. We need to make sure that we are prepared to pack wounds. Again, we're in the hospital. We don't pack wounds. The docs pack wounds. Well, let me tell you, if 30 people show up in 90 seconds and they've got massive hemorrhage going on, everyone with a pulse is going to be packing wounds and applying tourniquets and direct pressure. Okay? We're going to be putting chest seals on. How many of you carry even commercial grade chest seals in your department? Something for you to think about. We're going to control the airway. We're going to be able to be a little bit more definitive in our airway control there, but again, 30 patients showing up in 90 seconds, it's not like you're going to be intubating everybody, nor should we necessarily. We're going to need to intervene for tension pneumothorax because that's going to be a big threat. We're going to want to keep them warm. And then ultimately, if we're not a trauma center, we need to be thinking about what our limitations are with these patients that are showing up to a hospital. Because remember, they're not coming by pre-hospital care. So they don't know that they're not coming to a level 1 trauma center. They know they're coming to a hospital, and hospitals are supposed to take care of us. So again, you may need to facilitate very rapidly transfer to higher level care. You also need to know if your department stocks tourniquets. And if they do, where are they? And if they are, how many do you have? All right. If you don't know if your hospital stocks commercial tourniquets, that's a problem. If you don't know where they are, but you know that you have them, that's another problem. And if you don't have enough, and how many is enough, I couldn't tell you. I know most emergency departments, and I know that stock them in bulk, like 50, 100 in bulk. So again, you got to question yourselves. And I can see some of you out there now. Question marks are popping up over your own. Light bulbs are going off. I don't know. You should find out. How about bleeding control kits? Predetermined kits that have all of the stuff that you need in them that you can rip off the wall, or they're sitting behind a triage desk. How many of you have those? If you don't know, then you should know. Because you get 30 or 40 patients who come through in 90 seconds or 3 minutes, and they're bleeding bad. You don't have time to be running around getting a tourniquet from here and packing gauze from here and a chest seal from here. You need everything together. There are some departments that have gone to having basically chests of these bleeding control kits that they pull out from right at wherever the door might be that you could receive these casualties, and they can start affecting treatment right on the spot. Another question to ask yourself is, do you have a personal beacon kit? We're all healthcare professionals. We're in the emergency space, and the chances are we probably would pull over or help out at the scene of a bad accident. And do we have the right tools if that happens? If you don't have those tools, then you need to get them. So what are you going to expect now when the ambulances arrive or when the patients start showing up, 30 patients in 90 seconds, right? This is artwork called Chaos in the ER. And this is really probably paints a good picture of what can go through our minds as to what's happening. But let's make it, instead of it just being just ridiculously bad chaos, let's make it organized chaos, like we're used to dealing with on a daily basis. So what are we going to expect? When the ambulances arrive in particular, the ambulances are going to probably contain multiple survivors. We're not going to just waste the time of one ambulance, one survivor. We're going to put several survivors in there. Now, we're not going to necessarily put multiple critical patients in there, although I'm going to tell you that if I've only got one ambulance and I got 3 criticals, then the ambulance is taking more than 1 critical. But what we teach in RTF classes is 1 red, 1 yellow, 1 green go in an ambulance, or 1 red and 2 yellows, or 2 reds and 1 yellow. Don't send an ambulance with only 1 patient when you've got multiple patients. And when you get to the emergency department, give a very succinct, even before getting to the emergency department, but as you get to the emergency department, give a very succinct handoff report. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the missed handoff method. It's something that we certainly use within my department here at St. Joe's. It's very quick. It's basically, we call it our trauma timeout. But again, in an active shooter situation and you're delivering multiple patients, it's 90 seconds, and not even that necessarily, of what happened. You're giving the mechanism of injury, what the injuries were that you found, the symptoms and the vital signs, and then any treatments you did prior to arrival and what the patient's outcomes were from that. Boom. That's it. That's done. Real quick, down and dirty. And nurses, we need to make sure we give our pre-hospital colleagues the time of day. Give them the ability to listen to them for that 60 seconds. We can multitask. We can give them our undivided attention while we're actually putting our hands on someone who's in critical condition, but absolutely listen to them. Now, again, they're going to come in with very limited interventions, all right, particularly here in New Jersey. Our predominance of our pre-hospital system is basic life support, EMTs. So when these patients come in, they are not going to come in with IVs and intubated. Okay, they're going to come in maybe with tourniquets on. They're going to come in with packing in the junctions, which means the armpits, the groin, and the neck, if they've got hemorrhaging going on there. And they're going to have what we call seal the box, which means anywhere from the belly button to the clavicles, 360, they will have hopefully a vented commercial chest seal put in place. And then they'll have oxygen in place as it's applicable. That's the basics of what you're going to see. Okay, direct pressure, tourniquet placement, and wound packing. And all of that's going to go in place. And these are the pre-hospital limitations to what we have. The tourniquets hopefully are commercial tourniquets, the cat tourniquet being one of them, soft T tourniquets. They may also be improvised, depending on the number of casualties they have had in the field and what they had to improvise in order to slow or stop bleeding. The wounds are going to be packed with hemostatic gauze, or it may be plain gauze, or it may be any kind of cloth the person or the medic or the EMT or a bystander could get their hands on to wedge into a wound and fill the wound so tight that the bleeding was compressed. And there could be other stuff as well. We're also going to be seeing things like the chest seals, the commercial chest seals, both vented and non-vented. I prefer the vented chest seals because they are less apt to result in a tension pneumo. We also see taped gauze. We may see improvised chest seals put on. I'll show you one in a second. And we also teach the pre-hospital providers that antepenetrating trauma from the belly button up to the clavicles, 360 around the body, you want to put a chest seal on, just to be on the safe side. Or you can do what happened here, and this is a great video. If you get a chance, Google Lay's potato chip bag chest seal New York PD or NYPD, and you will get a great body cam footage of a cop who was an EMT as well, or maybe a former EMT, who actually came across somebody who was stabbed in the chest in the Bronx or Brooklyn, and actually fashioned a chest seal out of a Lay's potato chip bag and duct tape, and actually did a good job of stabilizing the guy. And you'll see that all in the video if you Google that. Don't Google it now, though. Basic airway management is the rule of the thumb. We don't need to be intubating patients. If we can maintain an airway, nasal pharyngeal airway oxygen, that's the best way to go. And keep them covered. Keep them covered, keep them warm. Hypothermia, we want to prevent that. We're in New Jersey, and we have a very limited number of advanced life support paramedics that are out there. So we can expect most of the survivors from either large or medium scale incidents are going to be coming in BLS only, with probably only one EMT caring for up to 3 patients. So that means they're not going to have IVs. They're not going to be given TXA prior to arrival. If you don't know what TXA is, look it up. It's a different talk for a different day. There's no pre-hospital medications for pain. There's no advanced airway. And advanced airway, I mean there's nothing beyond nasopharyngeal airway and just chin lift jaw thrust going on. And that's, again, can be expected in areas where you don't have a lot of capacity. I live in Somerset County. Somerset County has 2 medic trucks, and these are 2 medic chase vehicles on at peak times. It means I got 4 paramedics, which means that if I have an active shooter incident and I am just lucky enough to have those paramedic units dispatched and they can actually arrive on scene in a reasonable amount of time, I'm only going to have 4 paramedics. And if I got 30 patients, those paramedics are gone and out the door and not even on scene anymore with the first 4 patients. So it's going to take a while for more to backflow because of the limited number of providers that we have. So again, they arrive BLS only. It's because they didn't have ALS, and there should be no criticism paid whatsoever from our standpoint. So now the ball is in your court. It's now the time that you start treating the survivors and ultimately play your role in stopping the dying. That is going to be what we do normally. It's going to be how we run through, get the patients taken care of, and hopefully working in a system that is extremely automated for being able to deal with that. Hopefully you're drilling, hopefully you're doing exercises, and hopefully you're prepared to handle that onslaught. Once all is said and done, it's extremely important not to forget the after action. We need to debrief afterwards. We need to not only participate in our own institutional debrief, but we need to get in the room with the pre-hospital and the regional players in the aftermath. In this particular scene, we should be sitting down with EMS, law enforcement, the fire department, all of the institutions that were involved, because it's going to be more than one institution unless you are a single hospital in the entire region. You're going to be sitting down with the Office of Emergency Management. The communications dispatch center should be involved. The resources, there's lots of resources that may come in to help out for these incidents. They should be involved, and there's lots of other people. This is a very big thing when it happens, but it's very, very important that it does happen. And equal to this, and actually even more important, is making sure that our mental health is taken care of. We need to make sure all of our staff that have been involved with the care of these victims are provided with some level of mental health awareness. We need to do this as soon as possible after the incident. So it doesn't mean a week later. It means probably within the first 72 hours, if not 48 hours after an incident, that we're getting people to come in to provide emotional and psychological support for some of the horrendous things that we may see even as hospital-based providers. And we also don't want to forget our pre-hospital colleagues. So invite them to come in and sit with us. Invite them to come in to our own mental health debriefings. You can't make them. You can only lead a horse to water. But hopefully they will take you up on that. And again, as a partnership, a continuum of care, we will come together and we will be able to work together. So let me kind of close out tonight by going very quickly over what we have up and running here in the state of New Jersey right now with regard to Rescue Task Force. There are 21 counties in the state of New Jersey, and of those 21 counties, I am happy to say 17 have active, functioning Rescue Task Force elements somewhere in their county. Okay? There is one county that it's underdeveloped in, that's Sussex County, which is kind of central, middle, northwest section of the state. Unfortunately, there are 2 right now. There's there is one county that's unknown, that's Atlantic County, although I have to believe that they do have them. They just did not answer the survey that I sent out. And there are 3 counties right now that do not currently have RTF that we know of. One of them is the county that I work in. It's Passaic County, Union County, and Gloucester County. Gloucester County may have something. I just did not get clarity and heard that they did not. But that being said, if you look at where the trauma centers are situated, where hospitals are situated, almost every county is going to have an RTF element, which means if there's an active shooter in your county, the Rescue Task Force may be evoked. And then I want to pay particular homage to the 5 clinicians that are in this picture. They are 5 members of my 10-member Somerset County Rescue Task Force team that we were out doing a very lengthy training session, but they still had smiles on their face because they knew what they were doing was really, really good. An additional resource that I'll point you to is an article that I published in the Journal of Emergency Nursing back in 2020. It's called Prehospital Medical Response to Active Shooter Incidents, the Rescue Task Force Concept. Oh, look at that. It's the same title as the lecture tonight. So if you look it up by my last name, Weinman, and you just type active shooter, you will actually probably be able to pull up the fodder for that document. Moreover, I'm going to give you my email shortly. If you just email me if you're interested in getting a copy of this article, I will send you free of charge, because ENA will charge you, I think, $25 if you try to buy a reprint, or you don't have access. I guess if you're a member, you can access back issues of the journal. But if you just email me, I'll send you a copy if you're interested. So in summary, active shooter incidents are absolutely on the rise. It's not a matter of if it's going to happen, it's a matter of when it's going to happen. The whole caveat behind what we're teaching and what we're doing is stop the shooting, stop the bleeding, and stop the dying. And those three components are ultimately what will save lives in the event of an active shooter or other hostile situation. And then it's important for you to understand that you as an emergency nurse, you are integral. And how is that? Well, first of all, you can teach stop the bleed to the public, okay? To first responders, to our colleagues, all right? I speak about active shooter and I speak about kind of tactical EMS around the country. And I'm still alarmed at the number of at the times I'm speaking with nurses and physicians, conferences with nurses and physicians, and I ask how many of you have taken a stop the bleed class, and the number of hands that don't go up. It shouldn't be that way anymore. Anyone who works in an emergency department should have taken a stop the bleed class and should be teaching stop the bleed. You can also serve as a member of local and regional emergency preparedness committees, where you can be integral in making sure things get rolled out and things are happening. And you can serve as a member in RTF in your own community. If your community has a rescue task force program, find out what you can do to get involved. If you're out there right now and you're a nurse and you're also writing pre-hospital as an EMT, or maybe a pre-hospital nurse or a medic, if you're not teaching or doing stop the bleed, or you're not prepared in your agency to do stop the bleed, then that's a problem. And also look in the counties that you live in, because there's probably, as I showed you in that map, there's probably a rescue task force element somewhere not too terribly far from you that you can get involved with. And I wholeheartedly recommend that you do that. So with that being said, here's very tiny print references that are out there. There's really only one reference that you need, and that's the reference that I showed you that I authored. Pat myself on the back. No, just joking. But if you do want a copy of that article, just email me. Email me at Weinman, that's WEINMANS as in Steve, at SJHMC, St. Joseph's Hospital and Medical Center.org. Okay? So again, I thank you for your time tonight. I absolutely hope that you found this to be valuable. I hope you understand the critical nature of understanding the continuum of care, that it is not only what happens in the pre-hospital environment, but it's how it translates and how we then follow through once these patients arrive, once these survivors arrive at our hospital. And not to mention the fact that maybe I've motivated you a little bit to get involved, become a stop the bleed instructor, go out, maybe become a member of your own RT, or your own RTF if you have one in your community, and make a difference. So thanks for joining me tonight, and stay safe.